All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we are heading straight into gold rush territory.
Ooh, I love this topic.
I know, right? We're talking the California gold rush,
The 49ers.
the 49ers, all those dreamers who risked everything for a shot at fortune.
It really is a fascinating period.
It is. And in this deep dive, we are going to try to see this story through the eyes of those 49ers.
What was it like to be right there in the thick of it?
Exactly. We'll be using excerpts from a Wondery podcast episode all about the 49ers.
Looking forward to it.
Me too.
Yeah.
Okay, so imagine it's 1849, word gets out that there's gold in California. What happens next?
Well, you have this massive wave of people all heading west.
Thousands, right.
Thousands upon thousands, absolutely. And it's not just seasoned prospectors.
Right, it was like a cross-section of society.
Exactly. You had shopkeepers, farmers, teachers, lawyers, even clergymen.
Everyone wanted a piece of the action.
Everyone was hoping to strike it rich.
I guess it's that classic tale of the American dream, the idea that anyone could make a fortune with a little bit of luck and a lot of hard work.
Well, the stories we're going to uncover today reveal a much more complicated reality than just that simple dream.
Yeah, it wasn't all sunshine and gold nuggets, was it?
Definitely not. They faced incredible challenges and hardships.
Okay, so let's talk about those journeys.
Right from the start, they had this huge decision to make.
Overland or by sea.
Exactly. Each route had its own set of perils.
What did the podcast have to say about those options?
Well, let's start with the sea routes. The voyage around Cape Horn, that was brutal.
I can imagine. How long did that even take?
We're talking like 6 months.
6 months.
Crammed into a ship with, shall we say, questionable food and hygiene.
Ugh, no thanks.
Not to mention the constant threat of storms and diseases like scurvy.
It's hard to imagine being stuck on a ship like that for so long.
Then there's the Panama shortcut.
That sounds better, at least in terms of time.
Right, faster, but it wasn't cheap. It cost something like $300.
Wow, that's a lot of money, especially back then.
It is. It's like a small fortune in today's money. And even then, you had to trek through dense jungle.
I bet that was no walk in the park.
No kidding. Scorching heat, mosquitoes, and still the risk of disease.
The podcast mentioned Jessie Fremont, right? The senator's daughter.
Yes. She chose the Panama route.
Talk about a reality check.
Even with her privilege, she had to deal with all of that.
Wow. So the sea routes were rough, but what about those who couldn't afford either of those options? What was the overland route like?
Well, for many 49ers, it was the only choice.
Had to be tough.
It was a true test of endurance. They'd often start in St. Louis.
Which became this major bottleneck.
Right, everyone waiting for the spring thaw before they could head out.
I bet that created some chaos.
Absolutely. Everyone's trying to stock up on supplies. Demand is through the roof.
Prices must have been outrageous.
Oh, yeah. A barrel of pork could set you back $40.
$40. What would that be in today's money?
Try over $1,300.
Whoa.
Can you imagine that?
Yikes. That's a whole different kind of gold rush, the price gouging kind.
But even with these insane prices, the lure of gold, it kept them going.
Okay, so what about the trail itself? What was it like?
Once they set out, it was day after day of grueling travel. Just imagine following the Platte River, navigating the South Pass through the Rockies.
Talk about monotonous scenery.
Totally, yeah. And dwindling supplies, constant danger.
From what? Wild animals?
Wild animals, hostile encounters, the elements, you name it.
I can't even imagine.
And, the podcast actually shared a story that really captures those hardships.
Oh, yeah.
It's about a family heading west, and they get stranded by this flooded river. Their wagon flips, supplies are gone, and the husband, he'd gone ahead to scout for a safer crossing.
Oh, no.
And he hadn't returned.
That's terrifying. So they were just stuck there.
With the river raging around them.
And their supplies were gone.
On. Talk about a desperate situation.
I can only imagine what they must have been going through.
It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it?
Totally. But okay, let's say you make it to California. You've survived the journey. You arrive in the gold fields. What's that like?
Well, it was a completely different kind of challenge. It was this whirlwind of activity, hope, and desperation all mixed together.
I can only imagine.
And remember, it's a free-for-all. It's first come, first served. Whoever got to a good spot first staked their claim.
So if you were late to the party,
You might be out of luck.
you're left scrambling for leftovers.
Pretty much. So you can imagine how intense the competition was.
I bet there were some serious disputes over those claims.
Oh, absolutely. And as more people arrived,
The easy gold was gone.
right, the easy pickings disappeared pretty quickly. So miners had to get more creative.
Okay, so how did they adapt? What were some of the new techniques they started using?
They had to start digging deeper, using more elaborate systems to extract the gold from the earth.
That sounds like a lot of work.
It was. One of the most common tools was called a cradle. Basically, it's this rocking box with sieves and riffles.
Sieves in what?
Riffles.
Riffles. Okay, so how does it work?
You'd shovel dirt and gravel into the cradle, rock it back and forth.
And the water would wash away the lighter stuff?
Exactly. And the heavier gold particles would get trapped by the riffles.
I see. So it's kind of like a more efficient way of panning,
It was definitely a step up from panning.
which, as you said, was backbreaking work.
Totally. And with a pan, you could only process so much at a time.
Right. So cradles allowed them to process larger volumes.
Exactly, which increased their chances of finding gold.
Okay, that makes sense. So even with these new techniques, what was daily life actually like for the average 49er?
Well, life in the gold fields, it was brutal. It was backbreaking labor.
Day in and day out.
Yeah, under the hot sun. Food was scarce, often really bad quality.
Not a lot of options out there in the wilderness, I guess.
Nope. And the podcast even mentioned that scurvy was a huge problem.
Scurvy, isn't that like a pirate disease?
We think pirates because they were at sea for so long?
Right, lack of vitamin C.
Exactly. Well, miners weren't getting enough fresh fruits and vegetables either.
Makes sense. So what happened?
Well, it led to all kinds of problems. Weakness, fatigue, gum disease.
Yikes.
In really bad cases, it could even be fatal.
Oh, wow.
The podcast shared stories about miners losing their teeth, suffering from excruciating pain,
That's awful.
all because they weren't getting the right nutrients. It's a reminder of how, in those conditions, even something like a balanced diet can become a luxury.
It really is. So, beyond the physical challenges, were there also psychological strains? I feel like the constant uncertainty of finding gold, it must have taken a toll.
You're right, the podcast described it as this cruel lottery.
Cruel lottery.
Because you might be digging right next to someone who unearths a huge nugget.
While you're finding nothing.
Exactly. And that could really mess with your mind,
Yeah,
seeing that kind of disparity.
I bet. And I imagine there were also temptations to contend with.
Oh, definitely. Some miners would strike it rich and then blow their fortunes just as quickly.
Really? How so?
The podcast tells this story about a miner in a Sacramento saloon. He gets lucky, finds a ton of gold, and to celebrate,
He goes a little crazy.
he goes a lot crazy. He fills a whiskey glass with gold dust.
A whole glass.
Full of gold dust. Full of gold dust. And he dares the bartender to match it with liquor. He basically gambled away his entire fortune in one night.
Oh, man. Some people just can't handle that sudden wealth.
It really shows the two sides of the gold rush, right? Incredible opportunity, but also incredible risk.
Yeah, it wasn't just about finding gold, it was about what you did with it once you found it. But, not everyone was out there digging for gold. Some people realized there was another way to cash in on the rush.
Oh, you mean the people who were mining the miners?
That's the phrase, right? Mining the miners. What does that even mean?
It means finding ways to profit from the needs and desires of the prospectors. Like, think about it. You have all these people pouring into California. They need food. They need supplies.
I need entertainment.
Exactly. So, some savvy entrepreneurs saw this as a huge opportunity.
The podcast mentioned a guy named Lyman Bradley, right?
Yes. He arrived in San Francisco with his mining partners, but he quickly realized there was more money to be made selling signs to businesses.
Selling signs.
Yeah, because the city was booming, everyone needed signs.
And he just happened to have the skills to make them.
And the foresight to see the opportunity.
That's amazing.
And then there's Alonzo Delano, who was an artist. He traded his portraits for gold dust.
Portraits of miners.
Exactly. It's fascinating, isn't it? The gold rush created all these unexpected opportunities for people with different skills and talents.
It's like a whole new economy was born out of this rush for gold.
Absolutely. It was a time of immense change and upheaval. The cities themselves were transformed by this sudden influx of people.
Let's talk about that. How did cities like San Francisco and Sacramento cope with this rapid growth?
It was an explosion of growth, unlike anything they had seen before.
How fast are we talking?
San Francisco went from a tiny outpost to a bustling metropolis in just a few years. Its population skyrocketed from a few hundred to tens of thousands.
Whoa, that is explosive. I can only imagine the growing pains.
Oh yeah, the infrastructure just couldn't keep up. Sanitation was a nightmare, crime was rampant.
Sounds pretty chaotic.
There was this sense of lawlessness in many of these boom towns. So while the gold rush brought incredible wealth and opportunity, It also exposed some of the downsides.
It's like a double-edged sword, right?
Exactly. And unfortunately, not everyone benefited from the gold rush equally. We can't talk about this period without acknowledging the devastating impact it had on California's indigenous population.
Yeah, that's an important point that's often overlooked in those romanticized versions of the gold rush.
Yeah, it's a side of the story that deserves more attention. What were some of the specific ways in which Native Americans were impacted?
Well, first and foremost, their lands were overrun. Prospectors just came in with little regard for their existing claims or their way of life.
It must have been incredibly disruptive. Imagine your ancestral home suddenly becoming this chaotic, noisy, and often dangerous mining camp.
It's hard to even fathom.
The podcast talked about how this influx of miners led to the depletion of natural resources.
The resources that indigenous communities relied on.
Exactly. Things like fish and game.
So not only were their lands taken over, but their ability to sustain themselves was disrupted as well.
Exactly. And it gets worse. The podcast also mentioned how some miners tried to employ Native Americans in their operations.
But I'm guessing those arrangements weren't exactly fair.
No, they were often exploitative. Native Americans were subjected to harsh working conditions, unfair wages, even violence.
It's a far cry from a mutually beneficial partnership. It sounds like the gold rush, while bringing all this wealth and opportunity, also brought out some pretty ugly sides of human nature.
You're absolutely right. And the sad reality is the negative impact on Native Americans didn't end with the initial gold rush.
It had long-lasting consequences.
It really did. It marked the beginning of a systematic displacement and marginalization of indigenous populations in California. And the effects are still felt today.
That's heartbreaking.
The podcast mentioned a statistic that really stuck with me. During the gold rush era, the Native American population in California plummeted
By how much?
from an estimated 150,000 to just 30,000
That's an 80% decrease.
in just a few decades. A staggering loss.
It's a sobering reminder of the human cost of progress and the importance of understanding history from multiple perspectives. But even with these dark chapters, the gold rush undeniably had a profound impact on the nation. What do you think are some of its most enduring legacies?
Well, for one, it really accelerated westward expansion. It shifted the population and economic center of the country.
It put California on the map.
It did. It fueled the rapid development of California, transforming it from this sparsely populated territory into a state bursting with economic potential.
And on a broader scale,
On a broader scale, the gold rush contributed to the growing economic and political power of the United States, solidifying its position on the world stage.
it's amazing to think that this single event, the discovery of gold in a California river, could have such a ripple effect shaping the destiny of a nation.
And it's a story that still captures our imaginations today. It speaks to that enduring allure of the unknown, the dream of striking it rich.
The risk, the adventure.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, what would you have done if you were alive back then?
Right. If you were living in 1849, would you have packed your bags and headed west, lured by the promise of gold?
Would you have braved those treacherous journeys, endured the hardships of the gold fields?
And faced the moral dilemmas that came with that sudden wealth?
It's a question worth pondering.
It really is. The California Gold Rush. It's a tale of triumphs and tragedies, of dreams both realized and shattered. It forces us to confront the complexities of human nature, the allure of wealth, and the enduring legacy of ambition and sacrifice.
And for those of you who want to dig deeper into this fascinating period,
We encourage you to check out that Wondery podcast episode we mentioned.
they have some fantastic stories and insights.
And they also mentioned some great books on the topic.
Definitely worth exploring.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today.
Time flies when you're talking gold rush history.
It really does. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the California Gold Rush.
Until next time.